William Procter built one of the largest consumer empires in American history, and his family couldn't afford to keep his house. Not after bankruptcy. Not after scandal. After success. The mansion stood empty because wealth, once large enough, stops being owned and starts being managed, and management has its own interests. Let me show you how this works. In 1837, William Procter, a candlemaker from England, partnered with James Gamble, an Irish soap maker, in Cincinnati. The two men had married sisters, daughters of Alexander Norris, who suggested they combine their businesses since both required the same raw material, animal fat. By the 1860s, Procter & Gamble was still a modest operation, manufacturing soap and candles for local markets. Then came the Civil War, and everything changed. The Union Army needed supplies. Desperately. They required 1,000 cases of soap delivered to encampments every single day. Procter & Gamble won contracts to supply the Union forces with soap and candles, and the company exploded. They hired 300 additional workers. Factories ran around the clock. The small family partnership transformed into a $1 million enterprise almost overnight. Soldiers across the North became familiar with P&G products, and when the war ended, those same men returned home as loyal customers. The Civil War didn't just boost P&G's revenue, it created a national distribution network and brand recognition that would have taken decades to build through conventional means. By the time William Procter died in 1884 at age 82, the company controlled significant portions of America's soap and candle production. His estate was valued at over $100 million in today's dollars. His children inherited not just wealth, but institutional power, factories, supply chains, patents, trade relationships, congressional influence. This was not ordinary money. This was infrastructure. William Alexander Procter, the founder's son, understood what this wealth represented. In 1861, he moved his family from downtown Cincinnati to Glendale, Ohio, America's first planned railroad commuter town, built deliberately to escape the cholera epidemics ravaging crowded cities. He purchased multiple acres and built a beautiful estate. Glendale offered something crucial: it was connected by rail to Ivorydale, where P&G's main factory operated, and to downtown Cincinnati, but it was elevated, spacious, protected. The wealthy moved there not just for comfort, but for survival. The Procters didn't just build one mansion. William Alexander Procter and his wife Charlotte Elizabeth had 5 children, and each received substantial support. When their daughter Olivia married Reverend Cleveland Benedict, the rector of Christ Church, William Alexander financed the construction of a new stone rectory in 1903. He had the original 1875 frame building physically moved down the street to make room. In 1915, after both parents had died, the Procter children collectively donated a stone bell tower, new bells, and a clock to the parish, dedicated to their parents' memory. These weren't acts of charity. They were declarations of permanence. The Procters were building a legacy in stone. Meanwhile, James Gamble's side of the family was doing the same. James Norris Gamble, son of co-founder James Gamble, built an estate called Ratanack in 1875 on 60 acres at 2918 Work Road in Westwood. Named after the Gamble clan's ancestral hometown in Northern Ireland, the 2-story, 2,644-square-foot Queen and residence became the site where Gamble invented ivory soap in the mansion's kitchen. Ivory became P&G's signature product, the soap that floats. It revolutionized the industry and generated profit margins that funded the company's explosive growth through the 1880s and 1890s. If you've been watching this channel, you know this is the moment where liquidity starts to die quietly. In 1890, the Procter & Gamble Partnership Incorporated. The youngest partner, William Cooper Procter, grandson of the founder, recommended the change. He argued that as a corporation, the company could raise capital to develop and market new products at scale. A corporation, he explained, exists independently of the particular stockholders who own it. It can outlive its founders. It can access financial markets. It can grow without limits. What he didn't say, but what the family would learn, is that corporations also operate independently of family interests. Incorporation introduced a fundamental shift: the company was no longer managed by family consensus. It was governed by a board with fiduciary duties to shareholders, not to legacy. Professional managers replaced sons-in-law. Quarterly earnings replaced generational thinking. And wealth that had been personal became institutional. William Cooper Procter himself became president in 1907 and led the company until 1930. Under his leadership, sales rose from $20 million to over $200 million. He was progressive. He instituted profit sharing for employees in 1887, gave workers Saturday half-days, and collaborated with labor leaders. But he was also the last member of the founding families to lead the company. After him, professional management took over completely. And this is where the structural trap closed. By the 1920s, the Procter and Gamble families still controlled significant equity in P&G, but that equity was no longer easily accessible. It was locked inside a publicly traded corporation with tax implications on every transaction. Selling large blocks of stock would trigger capital gains taxes, destabilize share prices, and erode voting control. Dividends provided income, but dividends are taxed. Borrowing against shares was possible, but loans require collateral valuations that fluctuate with market conditions, and loans accumulate interest and fees. Meanwhile, the estates they had built continued to demand cash. Continuous, relentless cash. Property taxes in Cincinnati rose steadily as the city expanded and property values increased. A mansion built on multiple acres in Glendale that seemed affordable in 1861 became a significant tax burden by the 1920s. Heating systems designed for coal became inefficient as infrastructure transitioned to oil and electricity. Retrofitting mechanical systems in stone buildings was expensive. Staff wages increased. Insurance premiums climbed as properties aged and fire risks mounted. Maintenance alone, roof repairs, masonry work, foundation stabilization, groundskeeping, ran into tens of thousands annually in period dollars. And none of these costs could be deferred. A mansion is not like a stock portfolio. It degrades in real time. Deferred maintenance doesn't pause costs, it compounds them. A roof that isn't repaired leaks. Leaks damage ceilings. Ceiling damage spreads to walls. Walls rot. Rot weakens structures. Structures become dangerous. Dangerous buildings lose value and incur liability. The families faced a bind. They were asset-rich and cash-poor. Their wealth was tied up in P&G equity that couldn't be liquidated without severe consequences. So they did what wealthy families do, they borrowed. They took loans using P&G shares as collateral. They refinanced properties. They restructured trusts. And every transaction generated fees, legal fees, financial advisory fees, appraisal fees, administrative fees. The wealth was still there, on paper. But accessing it required feeding a management apparatus that extracted value at every step. Then came the Great Depression. P&G's stock price collapsed. The value of collateral dropped. Lenders called in loans. Families that had borrowed against shares faced margin calls. They had to choose, liquidate P&G shares at depressed prices and lose dynastic control, or liquidate property. The estates, for all their symbolic weight, were just real estate. And real estate, unlike voting shares in a family company, could be sacrificed without losing the institutional power that P&G represented. But here's the mechanism most people miss: they couldn't sell the properties easily. The market for Gilded Age estates during the Depression was nearly non-existent. Who purchases a property that costs more annually to maintain than most American families earned in a decade? The Gamble house at 2918 Work Road sat vacant after Olivia Gamble died in the 1960s. It had been in the family for nearly a century, but by the mid-20th century, no one wanted to live there. The property was transferred to the Greenacres Foundation, a private family foundation headed by Louise Nippert, whose late husband Louis Nippert was James Norris Gamble's grandson. The foundation held the property for decades. Not because they treasured it. Because they couldn't afford to maintain it and couldn't find a buyer. The estate had been reduced from 60 acres to 15 through subdivision and sale. In 2010, Greenacres finally announced it was seeking demolition permits. They cited repair costs exceeding $1 million. The Cincinnati Preservation Association offered $150,000 to purchase and restore the house. Greenacres rejected the offer. A second offer of $250,000 was rejected. The foundation didn't want money, it wanted to stop the bleeding. The city tried to save the Gamble house. They placed it on the local historic landmarks list. A federal judge ordered Greenacres to stop dismantling the interior. The Zoning Board of Appeals denied demolition permits. But in July 2011, a county magistrate ruled that the demolition could proceed, noting that the house was declared historic only after Greenacres filed for demolition. The court sided with property rights over preservation. On April 1, 2013, the Gamble House, where Ivory soap was invented, where one of America's great industrial fortunes was born, was demolished in less than 3 hours. If you're still here, you're beginning to see what the financial system actually optimizes for. The Procter estates in Glendale followed a similar trajectory. The mansions that had housed 5 generations of one of Cincinnati's most prominent families were sold, subdivided, and in some cases demolished. In 2024, Glendale Heritage Preservation announced that 2 Procter family estate mansions had been torn down. The properties had changed hands multiple times. Each owner faced the same problem: the buildings were too large, too expensive, and too outdated to function as private residences in a modern economy. Zoning laws restricted commercial development. Historic preservation rules limited modifications. The estates existed in legal and economic limbo: too expensive to maintain, too protected to demolish, too impractical to modernize. Now let's talk about what happens when wealth requires professional management. William Cooper Procter's profit-sharing program, launched in 1887, was revolutionary. At the first dividend day, he told employees they deserved to share in the firm's earnings. It was progressive. It was generous. And it locked the company into a structure where labor costs and profit distributions were contractually obligated, regardless of family priorities. This wasn't weakness, it was the responsible thing to do. But responsibility to employees, shareholders, and regulators creates structures that operate independent of family wishes. By the mid-20th century, P&G was governed by professional managers who had never met the founding families. The board's fiduciary duty was to shareholders, millions of them, scattered globally, buying and selling shares every day. Family legacy was not a line item on the balance sheet. Estate preservation generated no returns. Historic properties generated costs. And costs, in a system optimized for shareholder value, are eliminated. This is the paradox: the tools that preserve wealth also prevent legacy. Trusts restrict distributions. Boards discourage non-revenue expenditures. Advisors counsel liquidity over sentiment. The family is wealthy, but they cannot deploy that wealth toward symbolic preservation without dismantling the structures designed to protect it. Every incentive points away from buildings and toward balance sheets. Let me show you the accounting formula that explains why this always happens. Dynastic wealth is typically structured in 3 forms: equity, property, and trusts. Equity generates value but is illiquid; selling triggers taxes and loss of control. Property generates costs and depreciates unless maintained, but maintenance requires cash flow. Trusts provide legal protection but introduce management fees and restrict access. The family is wealthy on paper, but accessing actual money requires triggering one of 3 extraction mechanisms: sale, borrowing, or reorganization. Each mechanism enriches intermediaries, lawyers, accountants, brokers, trustees, appraisers. None enriches the family. This is why most industrial dynasties, Vanderbilt, Astor, Guggenheim, Mellon, lost their estates within 2 to 3 generations. It wasn't moral failure. It wasn't poor financial planning. It was structural inevitability. The system is designed to preserve capital, not buildings. It optimizes for efficiency, not memory. And efficiency, when applied to legacy, is erasure. Here's what makes this particularly insidious: the families believed they were making rational decisions. They hired the best advisors. They diversified portfolios. They established trusts, restructured holdings, navigated estate taxes, and followed every recommendation. They did everything right according to the rules of wealth preservation. And still, the mansions fell. Because the rules of wealth preservation aren't designed to preserve what you think they preserve. They're designed to preserve liquidity, returns, and transactionable value. They're not designed to preserve homes, names, or memory. Memory has no yield. Legacy generates no quarterly earnings. Historic preservation doesn't compound. If you're finding this unsettling, that's because it is. Now let's talk about visibility and the cost of remembering. Today, Procter & Gamble is worth over $300 billion. The company employs over 100,000 people worldwide. Its products, Tide, Crest, Gillette, Pampers, Charmin, are in nearly every American household. The Procter & Gamble names endure as one of the most recognized corporate brands in human history. But the families themselves? Invisible. Most Cincinnati residents don't know the Procter family estates existed. There are no museums. No heritage foundations. No preserved mansions open for tours. The wealth survived. The legacy didn't. And this isn't accidental, it's structural. Wealth and legacy operate on different systems. Wealth is managed by finance, which optimizes for liquidity and return. Legacy is managed through visibility, which requires cost centers that generate no revenue: museums, archives, endowed chairs, preserved estates, publicized philanthropy. These are expenses. And expenses, in a fiduciary system, are eliminated. The Procter family could have preserved estates as museums. They could have endowed heritage foundations. They could have fought for landmark protections. But every strategy required deploying capital that wealth management structures actively discourage. Boards have fiduciary obligations to maximize returns. Trusts restrict distributions toward non-productive assets. Advisors are compensated for optimizing tax efficiency and liquidity, not cultural memory. The system wins by making preservation financially irrational. Between 1870 and 1930, America's industrial families built vast estates, Newport mansions, Fifth Avenue palaces, sprawling rural compounds designed to last centuries. By 1960, most were gone. Demolished, subdivided, converted to institutions, or seized for unpaid taxes. The wealth didn't vanish, it moved into financial instruments. Stocks, bonds, offshore accounts, family offices. The architecture was abandoned because it was inefficient. It didn't generate returns. It generated liabilities. This shift represents a fundamental transformation in American wealth. In the 19th century, wealth was visible, tied to land, buildings, factories, physical declarations of power. In the 20th century, wealth became invisible, it moved into balance sheets, tax shelters, holding companies. The power remained. The declaration disappeared. And invisibility isn't accidental. It's strategic. Visible wealth attracts scrutiny, tax audits, political pressure, public resentment, regulation. Invisible wealth operates quietly. It moves across borders. It restructures without headlines. It compounds without protest. The families who understood this early, Rockefeller, Mellon, DuPont, survived by going dark. The families who clung to visible symbols, estates, titles, public legacy, were dismantled by the cost of maintaining them. The Procter estates were casualties of this transition. They were 19th century power symbols in a 20th century financial system that had no use for symbols. What remains today? In some cases, nothing. In others, adaptive reuse. Properties converted to schools, nonprofit facilities, condominiums. The Procter name persists as heritage branding, a selling point for real estate developers marketing historic charm to buyers with no connection to the family. The buildings may stand, but they're gutted, subdivided, stripped of their original purpose. The wealth continues elsewhere, anonymized, compounding quietly in structures managed by people whose names you'll never know. This is the final stage of dynastic dissolution. The name becomes aesthetic. The history becomes marketing copy. The family remains wealthy, descendants still hold P&G shares, sit on boards, manage foundations, live comfortably. But they are invisible. They are beneficiaries, not builders. And beneficiaries, by definition, do not shape public memory. They inherit systems managed by professionals with no incentive to preserve anything that doesn't generate fees. If you've made it this far, you understand what's actually being optimized. Here's the brutal truth: William Procter was not a failure. His children were not wasteful. His grandchildren were not irresponsible. William Cooper Procter was a visionary who pioneered profit sharing and grew P&G into one of America's largest corporations. The families hired elite advisors, diversified intelligently, restructured proactively, and made rational financial decisions at every juncture. And still, the estates were lost. Not through incompetence. Through optimization. The system worked exactly as designed. It preserved capital. It maximized liquidity. It protected shareholder value. It just didn't preserve what the families thought they were building. Because systems don't have memory. They have functions. And the function of modern wealth management is extraction, not preservation. Every restructuring generates fees. Every trust administration generates costs. Every advisory relationship generates ongoing revenue for managers. The wealth moves, continuously, through channels designed to capture value at each transaction. The families aren't choosing this. The system is choosing for them. Trusts legally obligate distributions toward beneficiaries, not buildings. Boards owe fiduciary duties to shareholders, not history. Advisors are compensated for efficiency, not sentiment. Every structural incentive points away from legacy and toward liquidity. So the mansions fall. The names fade. The wealth persists, but it belongs to no one in particular. It belongs to the system. And the system has no memory, no sentiment, no loyalty. It only has optimization. And optimization, when applied to human legacy, is erosion. The Gamble house is gone. The Procter estates are subdivided or demolished. The families are invisible. The company thrives. And somewhere, in family offices and trust structures managed by professionals you'll never meet, the wealth compounds quietly, efficiently, anonymously. This is what winning looks like in a system that no longer values what it once built. And if you've listened this long, you're beginning to understand, the question isn't why wealthy families lose their estates. The question is why we ever believed wealth and legacy were the same thing. They're not. They never were. Wealth is a number. Legacy is a cost. And in a system designed to maximize the former, the latter is always, always, expendable.